France tells Britain to back off as the small boats deal fails again. France cries sovereignty after Britain commits another £662 million to stop the boats. France has condemned Reform UK's proposal to return small boat migrants to its coastline using the Royal Navy and Royal Marines. The French government's response was blunt. This would be a violation of French sovereignty as well as a violation of maritime law and international law. That objection identifies a real legal obstacle. Britain cannot simply order military personnel to enter French territorial waters or disembark people on French soil without consent. Yet Paris is delivering this lecture after years of British-funded patrols, surveillance systems, intelligence operations, and diplomatic agreements failed to close the route. Reform's Operation Fortress. Reform UK says Operation Fortress would place the Royal Navy at the head of a joint command involving the Royal Marines, RAF, Army, Border Force, Police, intelligence agencies, and the Coast Guard. The party promises that every unauthorized vessel entering British waters would be intercepted and its occupants detained, medically assessed, and returned to the country from which they departed. The plan would use offshore patrol vessels, military-crewed, rigid-hulled inflatable boats, and a Bay-class landing ship capable of holding people temporarily at sea. Reform says the operation could cover even the busiest crossing days and make the British side of the Channel effectively impenetrable. The most explosive part comes at the end of the journey. Reform would first seek an agreement allowing returns through a French port. If France refused, Zia Youssouf said Royal Marines would disembark the migrants on the French coastline anyway. That is the point at which a British border operation would become a confrontation with another state. The Royal Navy can conduct surveillance, support border force, and intercept vessels in circumstances permitted by British and international law. It does not automatically possess the right to enter French waters or land detained people in France against the wishes of the French government. Reform can pass domestic emergency legislation, giving British authorities wider powers in British territory. It cannot pass an act of parliament that grants Britain authority over French territory. France is legally strong, but politically exposed. France, therefore, has a serious legal argument against the unilateral part of Operation Fortress. The law of the sea, human rights obligations, asylum protections, and the duty to preserve life would all affect how an interception could be conducted. A vessel carrying vulnerable people cannot be treated like an enemy ship. But France's legal answer does not settle the political argument. The boats are overwhelmingly departing from French or nearby European territory, crossing one of the most heavily monitored stretches of water in the world and transferring the long-term consequences to Britain. The French position effectively asks Britain to keep respecting a system under which Paris controls what happens on French territory. Britain funds much of the attempted enforcement, and the British state remains responsible when a boat reaches UK waters. France guards its sovereignty fiercely, while expecting Britain to accept the consequences of movements beginning from its coastline. That imbalance explains why Reform's original plan to use the Royal Navy has political force, even where its most confrontational promise remains legally and operationally unproven. Operation Fortress is a response to the failure of consent-based border management, not merely a demand for more ships. Britain has already committed more than £1.10 billion. Britain committed approximately £476 million to France under the 2023 to 2026 border agreement. In April 2026, the two governments replaced it with another three-year package worth £662 million. The latest commitment includes about £501 million for established controls in northern France and £161 million for new tactics. It is intended to fund more personnel, intelligence work, drones, helicopters, electronic surveillance, detention infrastructure, and maritime interception capabilities. The number of personnel funded under the partnership is expected to rise from 907 during the previous cycle to 1,392 during the new one. Britain is therefore not refusing to contribute. It is paying increasingly large sums for another country to police departures from that country's territory. Some of the money has produced identifiable results. The authorities say joint work prevented more than 42,000 attempted crossings after the 2024 general election, while French cooperation contributed to hundreds of smuggler arrests. 6 so-called taxi boats were intercepted during the early months of 2026, after France widened its maritime tactics. Those are real operational gains. They have not, however, eliminated the route or created a sufficiently powerful deterrent against attempting it. Every major measure that failed to stop the route. Britain and France have signed repeated agreements covering patrols, border fencing, surveillance cameras, drones, thermal imaging equipment, intelligence sharing, and extra officers. Each agreement promised greater disruption. The central outcome remained unchanged. People who successfully launched and reached British-controlled waters were usually taken to Britain. The Joint Intelligence Cell was created in 2020 to target organized immigration crime. It supported hundreds of arrests and the dismantling of dozens of networks, but other smugglers adapted, replaced lost equipment, and packed more people into larger boats. Physical security was reinforced around ports, railway infrastructure, and established launch areas. Smugglers responded by moving launches, using longer stretches of coastline and developing the taxi boat method, in which vessels collect passengers from the water rather than waiting on a beach. The proposed maritime pushback policy developed under former Home Secretary Priti Patel never became a functioning deterrent. Safety, legality, and the absence of French consent left Britain unable to turn theory into a repeatable operation. Operation Isotrope placed the Royal Navy in command of the Channel response in 2022. It improved coordination, but did not have a mandate to return people to France. Once a fragile boat required assistance, the practical destination remained Britain, reinforcing fears that military involvement without a returns mechanism would simply create a more capable rescue service. The result was devastating for the policy's credibility. A record 45,774 people arrived in small boats during 2022, the same year in which the Navy was placed at the center of the response. The Rwanda scheme was supposed to break the expectation that reaching Britain meant remaining in Britain. Instead, it became trapped in litigation, legislation, and administrative preparation. The Home Office later disclosed £715 million of spending connected to the Rwanda Partnership and the Illegal Migration Act by June 2024. No asylum seeker was forcibly relocated to Rwanda under the policy. Only 4 people traveled voluntarily. The Illegal Migration Act 2023 promised that people arriving through irregular routes would be detained and removed, rather than admitted to the asylum system. Its central removal duty was not brought into practical operation before the government changed, partly because Britain lacked destinations capable of accepting people at the required scale. The Bibi Stockholm barge and the wider movement away from asylum hotels changed accommodation arrangements, rather than the incentive at the channel. They generated cost, controversy, and political theater, but did not establish a direct connection between an illegal crossing and rapid removal. Labour then created the Border Security Command and returned to the promise of smashing the gangs. Enforcement and removals increased, but targeting smugglers has not erased a profitable market with international supply chains and replaceable organizers. The one-in, one-out contradiction. The UK-France Returns Treaty was presented as a breakthrough because France finally agreed to accept some people who had crossed the Channel. Yet every person returned to France was to be balanced by an eligible person admitted legally from France. By early March 2026, 377 people had been returned to France, while 380 had entered Britain through the reciprocal route. The scheme created an orderly legal pathway and allowed some Channel arrivals to be removed, but it produced no net numerical reduction through the exchange itself. Meanwhile, 41,472 people arrived by small boat during 2025. That was the second highest annual total on record, and 13% higher than in 2024. Arrivals have fallen significantly in 2026, with approximately 14,500% recorded by the beginning of August, around 43% fewer than at the same point in 2025. That improvement must be acknowledged, especially when European supply chain disruption and stronger enforcement may have contributed to it. But more than 14,000 crossings in 7 months cannot credibly be presented as control. Nor does a lower total prove that the route has been permanently broken. Weather, smuggler tactics, boat availability, and displacement towards Belgian beaches can all change the numbers. France cannot demand unlimited patience. Paris cannot be blamed for every failure of British immigration and asylum policy. Britain controls its employment rules, asylum system, accommodation policies, legal processes, and ability to remove people who have no right to remain. France is also dealing with migrants who entered Europe through other countries, international criminal networks, and dangerous confrontations along a wide coastline. French officers have prevented thousands of departures, sometimes under violent and chaotic conditions. But the French government cannot reasonably expect Britain to treat the current arrangement as satisfactory. British taxpayers have financed successive layers of French enforcement, while annual crossings climbed from 299 in 2018 to 45,000 to 45,074 in 2000, 36,816 in 2024, and 41,475. The response from Paris is effectively that Britain may fund French action, request French action, and negotiate for French action, but it may not act unilaterally when France decides that sovereignty prevents it. Legally, France may be right. Politically, that is precisely the dependency reform is exploiting. Could Operation Fortress work? The surveillance and interception components are technically possible. Britain can bring military and civilian resources under a clearer command, detect launches earlier, meet vessels entering UK waters, and detain occupants where lawful powers exist. The decisive problem is destination. If France accepts returns, much of reform's military spectacle becomes unnecessary, because an agreed transfer operation could be conducted through ports. If France refuses, sending armed Royal Marines onto a French beach would risk a grave diplomatic incident and resistance from French authorities. There are also practical questions about detention at sea, asylum claims, identification, vulnerability assessments, the use of force, and responsibility for anyone rescued from an unseaworthy boat. Reforms claim that crossings could be eliminated within a fortnight is therefore a political promise, not a demonstrated operational fact. Nevertheless, the proposal changes the argument. It rejects the assumption that Britain must continue paying, negotiating, and receiving arrivals, while every tougher option is dismissed before the existing system delivers control. What must happen next? A credible government would use the threat of unilateral British enforcement to demand a formal, large-scale returns agreement with measurable obligations. Future payments should be tied to transparent outcomes with clear data on launches, interceptions, prosecutions, returns, and displacement into Belgium. Britain must also accelerate decisions, enforce failed claims, attack illegal employment, and negotiate returns agreements with countries of origin. Interception without removal merely moves people from a dinghy into the British system. France's sovereignty deserves respect, but British sovereignty cannot mean permanent dependence on French permission. Paris has now drawn its red line. Britain must decide whether to keep financing the same basic model or build enough legal, diplomatic, and operational pressure to force a different result. Operation Fortress has not yet proved that Royal Marines can lawfully place migrants back on French beaches. What it has proved is that the old answer, another agreement, another payment, and another promise of improved cooperation, is losing its political power.